If you don't already know, there was a guy who played in the NBA, and his name was Derrick Rose. And he won MVP in, I'm pretty sure, only his third year, which is pretty crazy. He was amazing. Like, I don't even know how he was that as good as he was, but he ended up getting injured, and he was just never the same. So today I'm going to be seeing what the NBA would be like if Derrick Rose had never gotten injured. In the first season of this simulation, the Chicago Bulls unsurprisingly had a record of 71-11. In the first round of the playoffs, the Bulls swept the New Jersey Nets. In the second round of the playoffs, the Chicago Bulls once again sweep their opponents. This time their opponents were the Orlando Magic. In the conference finals, the Chicago Bulls played the Miami Heat Big Three. Surprisingly, the Chicago Bulls actually ended up winning in 6 games. This was a very tough opponent for them. In the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls won their first championship in the simulation. Unlike in real life, Derrick Rose was able to not get injured and win a championship against the Mavericks. Derrick Rose had an amazing season, winning the finals and finals MVP, and almost having the greatest record of all time behind the Chicago Bulls and the Warriors. The Chicago Bulls finished the season with a record of 71-11, the 1 seed, the same record as last season. Derrick Rose won MVP, averaging 35-8, 1 steal, and 0.7 blocks on great efficiency. In real life, during this series, Derrick Rose was got injured, but since in this simulation he can't get injured, they ended up winning in 5 games against Philly. In the second round of the playoffs, the Miami Heat dropped all the way to the 4th seed, surprisingly, but somehow they did a better job against the Chicago Bulls, this time pushing them to 7 games, where the Chicago Bulls still won. In the conference finals, the Chicago Bulls this time went up against the Orlando Magic. The Orlando Magic were the 2 seed, and the Chicago Bulls are the 1 seed. The Chicago Bulls won in 7 games. In the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls went up against the OKC Thunder. They ended up going to 6 games, but the Chicago Bulls won. This was a great series, and Derrick Rose has now repeated. In Derrick Rose's 3rd season of the simulation, the Chicago Bulls went 72-10, tying the record of the original Chicago Bulls in, I'm pretty sure, 1996, which is an amazing achievement for the Bulls and Derrick Rose. In the first round of the playoffs, the 1-seeded Chicago Bulls played the 8th-seeded Cleveland Cavaliers, and to no surprise, the Chicago Bulls won, but they did end up going to 6 games. In the second round of the playoffs, the 1-seeded Chicago Bulls went up against the 4th-seeded Orlando Magic. They went to 6 games, but the Chicago Bulls unsurprisingly won once again. In the conference finals, the 1-seeded Chicago Bulls played the 3rd-seeded Philadelphia 76ers. They went to 7 games, but luckily the Chicago Bulls ended up winning, going to the final. In the NBA Finals, the 5th-seeded Portland Trail Blazers went up against the 1st-seeded Chicago Bulls. They went to 7 games, but luckily the Chicago Bulls ended up winning. Derrick Rose won Finals MVP, averaging 24, 4, and 9 on really solid efficiency. What a great season for Derrick Rose. For the first time in this entire simulation, the Bulls were not the 1 seed. Somehow, they were tied with the Heat, but the Heat ended up getting the 1 seed instead. In the first round of the playoffs, the 2nd-seeded Chicago Bulls went up against the 7th-seeded Detroit Pistons. They went to 5 games, but the Chicago Bulls ended up winning. In the second round of the playoffs, the 2nd-seeded Chicago Bulls went up against the 3rd-seeded New York Knicks. They ended up winning in 6 games. In the conference finals, the 1st-seeded Miami Heat went up against the second-seeded Chicago Bulls. This series started out kind of close because the Miami Heat won the first game, but the Chicago Bulls won in 5. In the finals, for the first time in this entire simulation, sorry guys, the Chicago Bulls ended up losing in the finals, sadly, to the Timberwolves in 5 games because apparently the Timberwolves have Kawhi Leonard now. The Chicago Bulls finished the season with a record of 67-15, the 1 seed. This is yet another great season for the Chicago Bulls. Derrick Rose won MVP, averaging amazing numbers: 33, 5, and 7, 2 steals, and 0.7 blocks on great efficiency. In the first round of the playoffs, the Chicago Bulls went up against the Miami Heat. They ended up going to 7 games, but the Chicago Bulls ended up winning. In the second round of the playoffs, the Chicago Bulls went up against the Indiana Pacers. They ended up going to 7 games, but the Chicago Bulls won. In the conference finals, the Chicago Bulls went up against the Detroit Pistons. They ended up going to 5 games, but the Chicago Bulls won. This time in the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls beat Kawhi and the Timberwolves. They went to 7 games, but Derrick Rose ended up hitting a buzzer beater to win it all. I think I'm going to end the video there. So far, Derrick Rose has had an amazing career, way better than his career in real life. This probably, maybe not all of this is accurate, but most of this could have actually happened if Derrick Rose had never gotten injured. He could have won a championship with the Bulls, and the Bulls could have more than 6 rings all time. That would be crazy. But yeah, Derrick Rose has had a great career so far. I will make a part 2. Here are the shout-outs for today's video. Potato_Mations and Alf Buys Sports. Thank you guys for the support. Really appreciate it.